And now in terms of like the splining to polish, everyone is different. So this is not like this is the way it is, and this is splining and polish, and everyone else is wrong. This is the way you have to do it. No, everyone's process is different. The way they approach it is different. So I have everything set up for the demo later, but I'm just going to write this out so it's a little bit easier to hopefully follow along with what I'm going to talk about here. So I have to set everything on here. Okay, cool. So we can typically break down animation in a few different ways. So the usual process is going to be you have layout. Layout or previs is another word a lot of people will use. Technically, these are two different stages, but we'll consider this as one stage right now. Layout and previs are essentially the building blocks of the shot. It's the essential movement of the camera, the overall movement of the character through the scene, but there's not really any animation to it. Honestly, I've seen a lot of layout where the characters just stay in their T-pose and they slide through the scene. And that's all it is. So that's stage one of animation. It is a way of getting an idea of the overall composition and idea through there. From there, we will usually go into blocking. Now, blocking to me, so my idea of blocking is setting the shot and getting the idea out there. So we don't need all of the motions. We don't need all the tiny little details. We don't need the lip sync. We don't need all the finger motions and polish and all of that stuff. The goal of blocking is to sell the overall idea. Think of it like an elevator pitch, where you're not trying to tell the whole story with all the adverbs and adjectives and all the different vocabulary and like all the fluff and beautiful language. It's literally like if we were thinking Star Wars, Luke grows up on a farm, leaves to fight the Empire, destroys the Death Star. That's the blocking of the first Star Wars film. Now that's a very vague blocking. Honestly, that would be more layout previs, but it's the grander ideas. So in terms of animation, if I have a character here and they're supposed to be turning, the blocking could literally be two poses, here and there. That sells the idea. It tells me that the character is turned. I don't need more information than that. And a lot of times blocking, you want to keep it simple, because if you go too far too early, it means that when you then ask for review or your mentor, your director looks at it, if they say, oh, wait, that idea is all wrong, we need to go in a different direction, you have to redo a whole lot more work. So keeping it more of a simple thing is usually better until you get refinement. Now, from there, we go into blocking plus. Now, what's blocking plus? What's so great about that? For me, blocking plus is the stage of animation where we prepare it to go into splines. So essentially, I want to prepare my animation so that when I hit that spline button and Maya starts to add in all the extra animation, it doesn't break. It doesn't explode. My character doesn't like go full poltergeist and have their head twist backwards or float on the ceiling or something like that. It just works. So blocking plus is just getting as many keys in there as possible. And usually I'll aim for like 2 to 4. So I'll have my animation on 2s and 4s before I go into spline typically. So that's the blocking plus. It's preparing for splines. Splines is when we hit the spline button, which is filling in all the in-betweens with animation. And now our whole shot is on ones because the computer's filling in those gaps. So now let's kind of look ahead a little bit. We're going to have splines, refining, and then polishing. And apologies for the handwriting there. So refining and then polishing. Okay, So what makes these three so different? Well, for me, splines is the process of taking what Maya gave you and bringing it back to look something good. And this could be Maya, Blender, whatever program you're using. When you first go into splines, things are going to break. If you think of the walk cycle, for example, in blocking, it'll look great. In splines, you're going to have a foot contact and the foot's going to slowly go to the ground. And then when it pushes up off the ground, it's going to go up, pause, up. There's going to be all sorts of weirdness that happens. Your curves are going to have weird pops and whatnot. It's going to be a pain. So splines is fixing all of that. It's putting extra keys where you need them, especially on the feet, making sure that all of your curves in the graph editor aren't doing weird things. So for example, if you have the ending of an animation, usually the curve is always going to flatten out right at the end here. Maybe I don't want that. If it's supposed to be a cycle where the character keeps walking forward, let's say just a walk cycle, you want your curve to look like this. By default, it'll look like this in the graph editor. So we need to change that. All of those things. It's going through and making sure your shot doesn't break, essentially. So that's splines, as well as pushing the shot a little bit further. So this is where, as an animator, you're not just doing any of these passes one at a time, totally separate. As I'm doing splining, I might do a little bit of refining. I might do a little bit extra stuff as I'm there. For example, with the feet, typically to fix it, all I need to do is make sure that you have the contact flat on the next frame. But while I'm there, I might start to add a little bit more extra motion in there and a little extra cool stuff because I'm already there. So again, splines to me is getting the shot back to an appealing state after hitting that spline button. Now, refining and polishing, these kind of go hand in hand, and honestly, the definition between them is super vague. Like when you're refining, you're going to step into polish territory. When you're polishing, you're going to step into refining territory. They're so close together. Refining is essentially taking all of that motion that you had in your first pass, and now that you've gone splines, and pushing it even more. It's doing a whole new pass on everything to push everything. Like, think of it like an exaggeration pass, essentially. You are making the weight more. So if the character's supposed to be heavy, let's push it even more. How can we add extra little details? So for example, if a character is going on the ground and they hit the ground, you get that slide in there, starting to block those little details in. It's putting in the extra elements that are, what's the right word I'm looking for? They're still big changes. They're not little tiny things that are going to be like, oh, it took the shot from here to here, but really you just feel it more than you see it. No, it's like, okay, let's take this pose that was like this, but now let's really push it to just make it as powerful as possible. And okay, the troll, I'll hold off on your question until you come back. So we have that, and then polishing is adding in the small details. And small details doesn't mean like pixels worth of motion, but it's like taking your fingers and just making sure that you have this really nice offset to them, making sure that all the facial controls connect together on the face. Adding when the foot pushes on the ground, maybe the toes split apart a little bit. It's those little details that make a shot come to life in a whole new way and really sell the tiny things. So that's usually what I consider polish. But polish can also be larger things. It's looking at the negative space. It's pushing all your bend bows. It's shaping and sculpting every pose. And again, polish is so large that there's no like, oh, just do these 20 things and then you've got a shot polished. It all depends on the shot. It depends on the style of the shot. It depends on what you're trying to achieve in the shot. but that list can be near infinite, which is what makes polish such a pain. So that's usually the way I tend to break things down, usually. Now, this is the animation learning steps. As an animator, once you have that experience, you don't need to follow these steps as is. So for example, when I'm animating now, I'll usually start with layout, previs, because that's always a good place to start, to block out that shot, to understand what you're doing. And then I actually block in splines. So when I'm blocking my shot, my very first pass is already in splines. So my first pass of animation is incorporating usually all of this together as one giant chunk of animation. I'm still applying a lot of the same mechanics and ideas, but I'm kind of bringing them all together as one much more quickly. And that's just comes from experience. So you can get that a little bit faster. And then the refining polish is kind of another chunk right there, because again, they move or they're so close together that I'll just start doing the big adjustments and the fine adjustments together at the same time. So yeah, and that's the thing, like, blocking and spline feels so distracting. I tend to focus on small things that don't really matter at the stage. That's the tricky part. And when I started animating, a mentor suggested, hey, you should try blocking and splines. It'll go way faster. The very first time I tried it, I vowed to myself that I would never animate in splines ever again. I would never block in splines ever again, because it was horrible. It was a nightmare, because at the time I didn't know how to focus on one thing versus another. I would just like see it in splines, and I started already doing all the polish and refinement versus thinking of the big picture. As I got more experience, when I tried it again, I was able to focus on the things that I need. Yes, it's the shots in spline, but you're still just looking at your key poses. And then from there, you're looking at your breakdowns, and you're looking at your different stages. So it ends up being faster because you're doing multiple things at once, but you're still thinking of them. That's the key. And it just takes practice. Now, this is one form of animating, the blocking plus splines. Now, another form is, and this would be like the DreamWorks method. And I saw someone mention something about the DreamWorks message. I'll go back up in the chat to see about it here. But what they will do is they tend to block the shot on fours right away, so that you have the layout and previs. And then when you block your shot, you're just putting the whole thing on fours right away. So your first pass of blocking, the whole thing is on fours. So what they're doing is essentially they're just combining blocking and blocking plus together in one go. That's all it is. And it's using a straight ahead method. So it's just a different way of approaching the animation. That's all it is. Some people like it. Most people, once they try it, like it quite a bit. Other people, not a huge fan. But the big thing with this is if you start learning with that method, just go straight into fours. If you don't know the animation principles behind it, what ends up happening is a lot of people will fall into rotoscoping, where they just copy their reference exactly, and that's it. And yes, you'd retime it later. So you just rotoscoped your animation, and it just looks like rotoscope. So the key to this method, the fours method, fours blocking, is that you need to still apply all your animation principles, your exaggeration, your appeal. You're not just copying your reference, you're pushing it to an extreme, shaping it and creating something new out of it. And that takes practice. So usually when you're first learning animation, I recommend splitting everything as separate chunks and working pose to pose, because it's going to teach you those fundamentals. And once you understand those, then you can start kind of merging some of these together and working much, much faster. So I hope that all makes sense. And if anyone has questions on any of that, definitely let me know. And yeah, so the DreamWorks method, yeah, 4s and 8s on the first pass. So for fast dance, what do you suggest? 4s or 2s or maybe 3s? Honestly, it's whatever you need. If I'm going into splines, what I want to make sure is that there's going to be no information that is missing from my shot. And for fast motions, it depends on like the type of fast motion. If it's like something like this, that would be on 1s. I'd be blocking that on 1s. If the whole character is doing like this kind of thing, I would be blocking that probably on 1s, maybe 2s. If it's just like a and it's still pretty fast, I could probably do that on 3s and 4s. It's essentially making sure that you have enough keys when you hit splines. It's not going to just do weird things. So it really depends. And it's just honestly also down to personal preference. I know a lot of people who just go like a few keys and then go into spline right away and then just keep working in splines. And like I was saying, I actually just work in splines right from the start. So I'm still aiming down to those 2s to 4s, but I'm working from splines into that versus working to 2s to 4s and then going into splines. Everyone is different, and you have to practice and find the thing that makes most sense to you. And this is why having a whole bunch of workflows can be really, really helpful, because you can find the one that works best, not just for you, but for the situation.